in this. Well, there's 3 presentations in this session. In the first one, we have Liz Kurznorrich with Repositories. Are you ready to roar?
Excellent. Thank you, Leva. All right. Can you see my slides?
Looks great.
Excellent. All right. So as Leila mentioned, I am Liz Kurznorrich, and I am the adoption manager at Datasite and also for the Research Organization Registry, or ROR initiative. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about ROR in general and its application to repositories. And if you were here for the last session, Tanya's presentation, the end of it is actually a really good segue because she talked a bit about persistent identifiers of all sorts in repositories. So we'll go through some ROR basics, best practices, as I mentioned, and we'll take a look at an example implementation in Dryad, and then I'll point to a few resources for you. So to set the context at kind of a high level, consider this. This year, humans landed not 1, but 2 rovers on Mars. We also developed vaccines at record speed, and so far in the past 6 months have delivered over 1.6 billion doses worldwide. By comparison, finding answers to questions like which items across a whole bunch of repositories were authored by researchers at my institution, and where are researchers from my institution depositing their open access papers or sharing their data sets. So it should be easy, right? But it's still hard at this point. Many, if not most, repository metadata records don't include any affiliation information, which makes finding things by institution pretty hard. When they do, this data is often stored as a string, which we all know when it comes to names is not a great way to disambiguate. So we have name variations, just like with person names in organizations. And we also have lots of same and similar names. So most countries have a Ministry of Health, for example, aside from the US. So how can we keep track of researcher affiliations and their association to research outputs in a standardized way so that we can easily automate things and more easily answer some of these questions? So I work in the persistent identifier space and have for quite a while. And over in the Pitasphere, we're always thinking, of course, persistent identifiers to the rescue. Oops. So kind of the grand vision of persistent identifiers is that we can use these different types of persistent identifiers to link people, places, and things all together through using those persistent identifiers in metadata. So for example, we can link an object identified by a DOI to an institution using another type of identifier, an organization identifier, or to a researcher using an ORCID identifier. So that's kind of the grand vision. So that's where the Research Organization Registry comes in, or ROR. It's a community-led registry of persistent identifiers for research organizations specifically. So you might be wondering at this point, why ROR? Why now? We already have organization identifiers. ISNI has been around for quite some time. Ringgold and somewhat newer player, but still been around for a few years. We have GRID. So why another one? So the gap that we're trying to fill, firstly, we're specifically focused on researcher affiliations, which means we don't do all the organizations in the whole world. We're just focused on research organizations. But really the big gap that we're trying to fill is serving as that open parallel to DOIs and ORCID identifiers, meaning that the metadata is open, the registry is open. Anybody who finds a ROR identifier can resolve it and get the metadata associated with it. So won't run into paywalls or just dead ends. To that end, our metadata is fully open. We have public open APIs and open data dumps. And also really importantly, it's a community-led initiative. ROR is not actually an organization itself. We are sort of collectively run by California Digital Library, Crossref, and Datasite with guidance from community steering groups, advisory groups, and working groups. So the overall idea behind ROR and how it should work in a sort of tactical way is that researchers submit articles and data sets to systems that are integrated with ROR. They, of course, identify their affiliation, or their affiliation is somehow associated with that object using a ROR identifier. Maybe they select it by hand from a drop-down list, or it's added somewhere else along in the process. And that ROR identifier and affiliation metadata is included in metadata, for example, DOI metadata for that item. This then makes it hopefully easy to track and discover research outputs by affiliation. At least that's the goal. So to achieve this goal, as I mentioned, we have the registry, we have our open data dumps, we have several different APIs, and then built on top of those APIs, we have an open refine tool that you can go through a spreadsheet of organizations and find the ROR identifiers for them. So great, wonderful. We like open infrastructure, open technology. How does this relate to repositories? So in sort of in our grand vision, and we're still working out the exact best practices for repositories as we partner with pilot organizations. But at a basic level, the steps would include capturing the affiliations first, which I know is not necessarily a small task, but that's the point that we have to start at. So depending on how those items are getting submitted, this example shows a drop-down menu that's populated by ROR, the ROR list, but through our other API endpoints, you can also match organization information in other ways. And then the next step would be including those ROR IDs in, for example, DOI metadata. And we at Datasite started supporting affiliation identifiers in 2019 in version 4.3. So with that ROR identifier then in the Datasite metadata, that goes out into the vast soup of DOI records out in the universe, and then via all of the APIs that exist to get metadata records from DOI services, you can then kind of aggregate that information. So at Datasite, we run several different APIs that allow you to query and get information back out of Datasite, but also our Datasite Commons interface allows querying both Datasite and Crossref records. So I'm showing this example because it's one that we have that exists, but there are plenty of other services that consume DOI records and either aggregate them together. So Scholar Explorer is an example, or just consume them to integrate into their own services, so some CRIS systems. But this is our search tool, allows typing in an affiliation basically, and then bringing back all of the research outputs that have that affiliation in their metadata. And of course, you might have lots of back files, records that don't have affiliations. We have an affiliation string matching API endpoint that is designed to kind of help with that use case. But when we get into the Dryad example, I'll talk a little bit about how they ended up ultimately going about that particular step. So to the Dryad case. You may be familiar with Dryad. It's a general purpose data repository. It's open to all researchers anywhere all over the world. Dryad's been assigning DOIs to all of their items via Datasite basically kind of since the beginning, or at least since the beginning of Datasite. So they have many years worth of DOIs and DOI metadata in their system. However, they did not start collecting any affiliation metadata before implementing ROR. They decided to add this in 2019 as part of a major system-wide revamp. So here's the screenshot of their submission form. They do now require institutional affiliation, and that dropdown is populated from the ROR API. I will say there's fallback. Users can enter their institution if they don't find it there. They do include the ROR identifier in their Datasite DOI metadata. So you can see even some researchers have multiple affiliations. You can put those in there. And then, so just looking at this example that we saw in the last slide, in the Datasite Commons, interface, at least, you can take a look at that item and then see that this author is affiliated with the University of St. Andrews. Click there, and then you can see all of the other stuff out in the universe that is also associated with the University of St. Andrews, whether it lives locally in their repository or somewhere else like Dryad. So again, this is an example from Datasite Commons. There are other data tools and services that also consume DOI records. So this is not the only game in town, just our example. So those Dryad back files, they went through a tremendous effort to match affiliations to their existing items by finding publications that were associated or cited or that cited those data sets and then matching the affiliation there. So it was a lengthy process. And I do admit that it was a huge amount of work, but they did go back and add affiliations for almost everything in their collection. There were some that they, of course, couldn't find affiliation data for. So finally, I have some resources for you, or ROR sources, as I like to say. I'll let you know that we are, as I mentioned, working on a best practices guide for repositories, and that will be published on a shiny new support site that we're working on. It will hopefully be live very soon. We're going to be starting kind of an outreach campaign to our repository platform and service providers very soon to start increasing integration in those platforms. If you have a platform that you're using that you really would like ROR integration with, contact us and let us know at info@ror.org, and I can gently harass folks a little bit. For now, until we have our shiny support site launched, we have a resources page that links out to all of the different stuff that we have. We have a mailing list that you can join, and we also have an API users group for technical updates, and we have our API documentation currently in our GitHub repository. So I'll put these slides in Zenodo, and then you can get these links. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for joining and listening.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was a great presentation. I appreciate your commitment to lion icons and photos. If you have questions for Liz, go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And I'm going to use a moderator's privilege and ask, is there a use case for that you haven't seen yet where you think people like it should be in use other than repositories in a solid way?
There's definitely the publishing use case, which is the other angle. We're really working on integration, and ideally, we want to be able to link up publications to their corresponding, to play a role in that whole linking corresponding publications to data sets and preprints and postprints and all that sort of stuff. That's a bit dependent on the updates to the Crossref metadata schema to support that. There are interesting use cases that we're working on in the area of transformative publishing agreements and using ROR identifiers as kind of the high level identifier to figure out where which papers belong to which organization.
potentially that could get things adopted faster rather than slower.
Right.
Yeah.
Funding is another area that's a less well-developed area because until very recently, the metadata schema for grants wasn't widespread and in existence. So with Crossref's release of their grants schema, that's a greater possibility. So being able to identify all the stuff associated with a particular funding organization.
And then Liz, there's a question from Sherry Lake, who asks, in the repository where ROR ID names fill automatically, can there be an option for not in ROR where the field would take text? Is that where you were getting at?
Yeah, so there's, that's kind of an implementation choice as far as how that information is handled in, does it go into DOI metadata or something like that? It's absolutely possible to include just an affiliation name as a string in DOI metadata. But in the implementations we've been working with so far, absolutely, there's always a fallback. But I will say, so we have a curation board and a curation process for adding organizations to ROR. And in the case where folks are finding users typing in lots of organizations that they didn't find in the list, that's something that we like to hear about so that we can send those over to through the curation process and get them added in.
Okay, if anyone else has questions, either save them for the end or get in contact with Liz, and I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them. In the interest of time, we are going to move along to our next presentation. So next we have Catherine Mitchell, who's the Director of Publishing, Archives, and Digitization at the California Digital Library, and Kristen Rattan, who's the Principal of Strategies for Open Science at Stratos. They're two of the co-PIs on this project, and their presentation is called Next Generation Library Publishing Project, Integrating Open Source, IR, and Publishing Solutions.
Thanks so much. Can everyone see my slides?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So thanks. We're really, you're not seeing the Zoom. Are you seeing the Zoom navigation in the middle of the slides? Okay, great. We're really glad to be here presenting at Open Repositories on the Next Gen Library Publishing Project, which is an Arcadia funded effort with the following partners: the Educopia Institute, Stratos, the California Digital Library, Longleaf Services, and the Confederation of Open Access Repositories. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with with NGLP, as we refer to the project, we're responding directly to the ongoing conversation across the library publishing community about the need for more robust open source publishing tools and a broader set of hosted publishing services. This topic has been a point of focus at the Library Publishing Forum for the last few years, and animates a great many of the informal conversations that we have among library publishers as we consider our increasingly substantial roles and opportunities within the scholarly communication landscape. So it's a big deal for us to think about how we can scale and how we can do the work that we need to do and that we have opportunities to do. So the goal of this project is to address this specific need within the community, and in so doing, to expand the range of publishing pathways for authors and for editors and readers who seek to distribute and access knowledge in ways that are values aligned with the academic enterprise. We recognize that we're not alone in this endeavor and appreciate in particular the remarkable spate of platform innovation in this space over the past few years. We also appreciate and build upon the substantial work and findings of the IMLS funded library publishing workflows project and other projects that will be called out more specifically in this presentation. So we began this project with a fact-finding mission to understand how library publishers work and how their current publishing tools and platforms might serve them better. In 2019, in the year 2019 to 20, so it was about maybe 18 months of work. We had consultations with nearly 300 stakeholders in some form or another discussing these issues. What we learned is that the library publishing community needs turnkey, hosted journal plus IR solutions as an alternative to bepress. Among the explicit wants animating this need were requests for an open source solution that is community owned and governed, a modular architecture that integrates existing open source platforms rather than creating brand new ones, mission-aligned service providers who are both affordable and reliable, robust reporting tools, metadata support, and because none of this matters if we can't get the data out of old systems and into new ones, migration support into any kind of solution that we developed. Based on these findings, we identified 4 central areas of activity that we believe are fundamental to the success of this project. First, understanding the range of technical tools and services within the open source scholarly communication space. Next, creating mechanisms to help technology and service providers affirm the values and principles that guide their work. Building infrastructure to support modular publishing and repository solutions. Kristen will get into the details of that. That's really core to our mission here. And then finally, establishing a healthy ecosystem of community-led, values-aligned service providers for the library publishing community. We also defined a set of deliverables that corresponds to these areas of focus. And you can see here some of them we've already delivered and others are forthcoming. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the values and principles work in a moment, so I won't get into the details there. But I think it's important to call out that we have released the Scholarly Communication Technology Catalog, also known as SCOMCAT, which provides, basically is a catalog of open source, mostly open source publishing tools and technologies, and is really meant to be a resource for the community. And it draws on a lot of the work that's been done in cataloging these materials previously, pulling it all together and providing a searchable interface for it. So please do check that out. And then we also have released a major report on our research findings based on our interactions with the community, library publishing infrastructure, assembling new solutions. And if you look at there's a URL at the bottom of the slide, you can find all of these deliverables there. And as you can see, we have both the interface and tools forthcoming, as well as the pilot instances of this solution that Kristen will discuss in more detail in a moment. So I'm just going to quickly spend a little bit of time on the values and principles piece of this work, which has been led by Catherine Skinner from the Educopia Institute. So drawing on the first deliverable that on the previous slide, we've devoted substantial work in this project to developing an analysis of the relationship between today's varied scholarly publishing service providers and the academic values that we believe should guide their work. In this analysis, we've considered how academic players from a range of stakeholder backgrounds have produced a broad range of values and principles statements, documents, and manifestos in the hope of recalibrating the scholarly publishing landscape. Based on our findings, we've recommended that academic stakeholders more concretely define their values and principles in terms of measurable actions so that these statements can be readily assessed and audited. And we've also proposed a methodology for auditing publishing service providers to ensure adherence to agreed upon academic values and principles, with the dual goals of helping to guide values-informed decision-making by academic stakeholders and encouraging values alignment efforts by infrastructure providers. We also explore ways to structure this assessment framework both to avoid barriers to entry, recognizing that different service providers will have different capabilities to achieve these values and principles, and they may be aspirational, but not yet there. And to discourage the kinds of gaming the system activities that so often accompany audits and ranking mechanisms. So this work around values and principles has resulted in some concrete deliverables, including reports and tools that we hope will turn our abstract intentions into an evaluation process that is both informed and transparent. And you can see the list here. I've already referenced the Living Our Values report, which is where we did a lot of the research behind this. Beyond that, we've built a common values and principles framework for scholarly communication, and we've provided a methodology for assessing values and principles adherence. We've also eaten our own dog food by demonstrating via these tools values and principles adherence by NGLP's own chosen technologies and partners. And we worked with Invest in Open Infrastructure, or IOI, to pilot these assessment tools by reviewing our own project. And we'll be publishing the final version of the Values and Principles Framework and Toolkit in 2022. So now I'll hand off to Kristen Rattan to describe the substantial technical development underway, as well as our work establishing a healthy ecosystem of service providers.
Thanks, Catherine. So listening carefully to the library publishing community for more than a year, it was fascinating and we learned a lot. And I'm sure we couldn't have predicted all of it. So one of the things we learned is that they are, like a lot of modern infrastructure builders, they're tired of large monolithic platforms and understand the value, but despite not being necessarily technical themselves, of interoperable modular solutions, a mix and match opportunity to be able to create the best solutions. And that's really the way a lot of technology is being built today. So that was really encouraging to hear. They're very committed to open source and community-owned solutions. And that has become a growing concern over the years of watching sort of mergers and acquisitions and things kind of going away, that they've come to rely on in more commercial and proprietary solutions. They didn't want us to reinvent a lot of wheels. They didn't want us to come up with the one platform that would rule them all. They wanted us to look carefully at what's out there. There are a lot of loved open source platforms and tools and protocols. And they said, look at where there are gaps, look at what's missing today and bridge existing systems, look at where there may be an API or something or an overlay needed. They said that they wanted service providers. So even library publishers who are not currently using a third-party hosted solution are gravitating towards that. So they were very interested in moving away from having to run a lot of their own open source internally. This was not 100%, but I would say we were at the 70 to 80% of people who are currently using open source are investigating moving to third-party hosted solutions. And that's one of the reasons why we talked about so much in the project, and Catherine referred to the need to have mission-aligned values and principles-aligned service providers, because that's a growing interest. And then people were wanting these platforms that they would be relying on to have sustainability models. So how can we create an ecosystem in which each section of the ecosystem receives payment and receives cost covering measures to be able to sustain themselves? And that's going to be required if we have a full ecosystem of open source plus layers of services. Next slide, please. So this is a sample technology. It's kind of the superset of some of the things we were looking at. We investigated a wide range of existing open source platforms and decided to start with 3. And this is by no means the full set of ones that we'd like to integrate, but they were the ones that rose to the top in conversations with library publishers. Janeway for journals, OJS for journals, and DSpace for IR content. And what people felt that these systems were doing very well was, particularly on the journal side, was managing submission and peer review, which is a complex set of workflows, and there are complex platforms that manage that. And that was one area where they were saying, don't reinvent these wheels. But what in particular people who were currently using bPress, but other library publishers also felt was, we have a need to combine journals with IR content on our delivery side. So they wanted a combined, unified front-end delivery mechanism that could show journals and IR content flexibly in different ways. So you could see a journal look as a journal, but you could also see collections that combined content across some of these boundaries. And that kind of flexibility and content agnostic framework was really important for people. So one of the things we're building is this unified web delivery platform that can take content from other platforms and allow library publishers to create collections, to apply different types of brands and imprints to those, and then for those things to be able to be delivered, indexed, harvested by many other services. So this could operate either as a kind of front-end journal and repository structure, or it could be an overlay on some of these other existing tools. The other area where there was some frustration was in analytics, understanding their publishing programs from a more end-to-end perspective. And so we are building and the other bespoke platform we're building is an analytics platform that will pull both workflow data as well as published data, usage data, page views, search terms, all of that into a unified place so people can see, library publishers can see all these analytics across the different components that they may be using. Next slide. So the web delivery platform is by far the more complex piece that we're working on. We've brought in Cast Iron Coding, the company that built Manifold, which is a really wonderful ebook platform, and they'll be doing the development. They are already underway. But as I mentioned, it's a unified schema-driven front end that can deliver journals and repository content and extend into books, OER, and other forms of content later. Those content areas were of importance to library publishers, but they emphasized, please start with journals and repository content first. So it can, as I mentioned, pull content in from other systems, other platforms, and it can support all of these different activities like collection building and, for example, creating imprints. So if you look, we modeled a lot of our requirements on what CDL is doing with eScholarship. And if you look at the site, you'll see that there are journals that look like exactly like you'd expect a journal to look like. At the same time, there are collections that combine all kinds of different content, including some of those journal articles. And that they carry different brands. One might be branded as a department or a special collection, and then something else is, all of the theses or all of the ebooks or all the journal content. It really important was to, as some of the discussions have already been happening in this meeting, was to have really clean content that can be indexed, structured metadata, persistent identifiers, using all of the harvesting protocols, and being able to be readable and indexable by tools like Google Scholar, which has put forth a lot of best practices that will follow. So this, as I mentioned, could exist on its own and be tied to other platforms, or it could be layered over an existing IR to deliver content in that kind of combined way if somebody were interested. Next slide. The analytics platform, as I mentioned, will kind of hoover up usage data and analytics data from, we'll begin with OJS, DSpace, and Janeway, but eventually others. And using APIs will pull that data into a unified system. It'll also pull data from the web delivery platform, so you'll be able to see all of that. And it can deliver that usage data back to the web delivery platform. So on an individual article, for example, or item in the repository, you can see usage data there displayed. It also will offer both the ability to mine data as well as to create sort of standard canned reports, and then offer some visualizations, maps, things like that. So this is also a great way to check and ensure that we have consistent metadata across platforms to be able to validate that. And we've brought in a coding organization called Cottage Labs to build this. Next slide. So one of the things that's a strong requirement was a healthy service provider layer. So trusted partners that can take these different technologies and host them, combine them in new ways to create solutions that meet the needs of different segments of the community, and be responsible for hosting and serving those up and maintaining them. Services like bPress have customer support involved. So we need service providers who are willing to offer similar types of services so that the library publishing community feels they can trust that these will be ongoing solutions that they can utilize. We're working with a number of different service providers, and it's interesting to note that they have different aspirations. Some are more interested in journal plus IR, some are more interested in books and journals and things like that. And so I think we'll end up, as we move towards piloting some, with a set of different pilots that meet different use cases, which I'm really excited for, because that is exactly why we were building in a more modular way. And we will be, also, as Catherine mentioned, we're vetting them against our own values and principles work. And we'll also be working with them on how to create community led and community governed discussions with the community and have a governance structure that is open and available. Next slide. So I talked a little about modularity. I'm not going to go on.
Just
okay.
Yeah.
1 minute?
Make sure we have time for the next presentation. Thanks.
Okay, so I just mentioned modularity means that different hosted service providers can create different kinds of services, and that's our goal. So we're at the very beginning of that. I think that's that. Is there one more slide, Catherine? This is who's involved. You'll be able to see that when you look at the slides. And then finally, we're very interested in who's interested in partnering with us. So please do get in touch. And we can put that link in the chat. Yes, everything is free, open source. We're using MIT licensing.
Yeah, if you have any other questions, please pop them in the question answer in the chat. And maybe we can answer those at the end, and we'll move on to the next presentation, just to make sure we have time for everything. So next we have Sarah Mannheimer, who's the data librarian, and Jason Clark, who's the lead for research informatics at Montana State University. Go Cats. And they're going to talk about Dataset Search, an open source tool to support data discovery, reuse, and analytics.
Yeah, thank you, Layla. Yeah, so this is, as Layla said, we're Sarah and Jason, and we're talking about this tool we made called Dataset Search. The project team, I'm the project lead, Jason is the technical lead, and then we've had several staff members and students working on the project over the couple of years that we've been working on it. Jim Esplin, Jacob Schultz, Rhonda Borland, Kyle Hagerman, and Daniel Layden. So we first started this project in 2018, and we actually gave a talk at OR 2018, which was in Bozeman, where we talked about the really early prototype that we had at that time. So we're excited that we're back at Open Repositories with the finished tool. So the goals of the tool were to promote discovery for data sets from MSU, based on some research Layla and I did actually, showing that data sets were more likely to be found if they were cataloged in more places online, and if they were in repositories, subject repositories, where their community was most likely to find them. Then we also wanted to support community data repositories like Dryad. So MSU now has an institutional membership to Dryad. And so we suggest if people can't find another place to publish their data, they do so in Dryad. And then we have this Dataset Search where much of the data that's published at MSU is all cataloged. And then we wanted to also support discovery for restricted data, which is a feature that we've added recently, and just to showcase research data as a legitimate research product that can be cited, reused, shared, and analyzed. So here are some of the features. The Dataset Search harvests metadata from DataSite and data repository APIs to automatically populate an index of datasets from MSU researchers, or that is the goal, to be somewhat automated. But then we have human curators who clean and edit the metadata records. And we also have visualization dashboards to showcase the data, which is a feature that's in beta. Our tool is optimized for search engines like Google, and it also supports discovery for restricted data sets. So today we'll talk about the public interface. Jason will take us behind the scenes and talk through that restricted data and some metadata and indexing ideas. Then I'll talk through continued challenges and some community collaboration that we're involved in. So first, the public interface. You can access it here, arc.lib.montana.edu/MSU dataset search. Maybe Jason can put that in the chat. And so here's what it looks like. There's this interface with a big search bar, and users can type in a search. I've used wheat, which is a common research topic in Montana. And here you can see that resulted in 5 records, and you can click into the record, see a little more metadata about it, and then click either the DOI or this Access Dataset button. And then that takes you out to the location of the dataset. So in this case, this dataset is in Dryad. And so that has even more metadata as Dryad does, including the related article. And then here's the dashboard. The idea is that because we have all of these data sets and a lot of metadata about them in our database, we can create some visualizations and ways to showcase the data for our administrators and for people at MSU who are curious. So these are just some sort of example visualizations that we've created so far, showing data sets by department and by month. So we only have 75 data sets in here so far, but we're continuing to add. All right, Jason, you want to take it away here?
Sure. Can people hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And related to, as Sarah was talking through the reasons why we're, trying to understand data as a research product that's useful for analytical purposes and for understanding how scholarship is produced and the associated objects of scholarship. That dashboard, it is in beta, but it also gives us a chance to kind of understand where is data being produced within MSU, collaborators per department, what are the likely production or dates for data. So what it turned in a moment was more about analytics, and I think we were thinking more about kind of analytics that are kind of on the back end or invisible. Wow, bringing that forward into the public interface has been just kind of enlightening for all of us. So I just wanted to mention that there'll be more development there. So as far as behind the scenes, if we could go to next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit first about the real work of this project had been finding our data sources and then bringing that data so we could collate and create an MSU data catalog. So what you see on the screen is we have a set of scripts that goes to various sources, uses various cues like researcher names, MSU keywords, affiliations, departments, disciplines, to pull back potential matches. Next slide. Once you are able to once you run those scripts, those create skeleton metadata records that we can actually queue up and make decisions about pushing into the tool itself. So this allows us to, as best we can in this moment, automate pieces of that harvesting so that our human curators have a chance to bring the metadata into focus and to really create the added value of their description work. Next slide. So the metadata is it's useful to think through. It's a set of as you push through, a human curator can use that skeleton record to add additional metadata and things like orchids. So we've been trying as best we can to come up with various researcher PIDs and various other ways of disambiguating our researchers. And Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about that, the continuing work there. Could I see the next slide? We've also got some enhanced areas where we add linked data categories, and you can kind of see where as a human curator brings forward the details, they can make decisions on whether or not to add a record or discard it. And so this is just a matter of bringing forward what that metadata looks like. Okay, next slide. One of the other use cases that Sarah mentioned is we wanted to work with, we actually have, this is the Center for American Indian and Rural Health Equity Care. They're a center on campus, which has a really rich set of data, but also a data that needs to be protected. They're NIH funded, and they study rural and Native American communities, health, do community-based health studies based on the indigenous and cultural beliefs of that particular community. But there's really fascinating and interesting data in this center, but it also has a need to be locally a different kind of access. So it's not open access, but we knew we wanted to make it findable and visible in certain ways. So we piloted this work with CARE, and you can see just kind of what it looks like in the public interface. Next slide. And as you push through, you get to an area where you can see the data itself. You get a good description of it. This is all indexed in public search engines, but as you push forward, you're greeted with a kind of caretaker for that data. In this case, it's James Burrows, who's one of the leads in CARE. So that was a really successful way where we were able to actually find a local set of restricted data and really work through the prototyping of how do we make that accessible in a broad way. Next slide. Beyond that, and Sarah's going to pick up on this in a little bit. Next slide. I'm going to talk a bit about metadata and indexing. And one of the things we wanted to do was understand how researchers were describing themselves. So we found that those kinds of the profiles that scholars make of themselves in places like ORCID, LinkedIn, Google Scholar, have a lot of metadata that we can add to records and not only connect to a particular researcher, but connect to the kind of topics and the data they write about. Because I don't know if I made this clear, but one of the things that comes back in that harvesting skeleton record is there's kind of a dearth of descriptive metadata. We can get some of the basics, but the keywords and the really rich description of that record are not always there. So this was a way, we have a set of scripts that actually does some harvesting of these various scholarly profiles and then connects that data and back to item records. So that's what you're seeing on the screen here. This also leads to even better search engine optimization, and the tool itself is following the schema.org dataset item standard so that you can, so it's picked up and understood in those settings. And we released in like the top of January. And now next slide, if we're starting to see some of those results come in because we're able to monitor and just understand how click-through rates are happening, what's the overall indexing, are all of those records, those records that we've seen so far, are they getting into the right areas? Are they understood by search engines? So next slide. A note: this is what you'll see. We have it available, this alpha release in GitHub, and it's archived in Zenodo as well. And Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about continued challenges.
Yeah, so thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We do have some continued challenges. I'd say they're basically these two parts of relating to the accuracy of automated search, scholar disambiguation. So because of part of what I think Liz was talking about in the first presentation, we are searching for names of faculty and grad students, which is a really somewhat inaccurate way to search for these folks at MSU, because there wasn't a good way to search for the MSU as an institution yet. And then we're also having some challenges with metadata and getting enough metadata in the index without having to do too much manually. So for scholar disambiguation, as I said, we have this list of faculty and grad students that comes in from our Office of Planning and Analysis. And part of what we're going to do next is try and curate that list so that we can make sort of take out people who we think will not be creating data. There's people, graduate students who work in departments in humanities who are likely to not be creating data, just to like reduce our list a touch. And then we're also going to try adding those Google Scholar, LinkedIn, ORCID keywords that Jason was talking about to the search to try and create more accuracy. Basically, what we're doing here is sacrificing some of the broad net we're sending out in order to get fewer false positives. So we're hoping that that will help a bit with what we're bringing in. And then for metadata, we're thinking we may narrow, at this time, we're calling the Dataset Site API, we're calling the Elsevier Dataset Search. We're using a bunch of different APIs to try and get as many results as possible, but we're thinking more, or even most data repositories now use DOIs. So we may try and narrow our API call to only DataSite as a way also to reduce the results we're getting and then to reduce those false positives. Also, more data repositories are using ORCID, so that could be another way to disambiguate our faculty and grad students from MSU. And then we're also excited about the research organization registry and DataSite's new inclusion of that in the metadata. So this is, I mean, we're kind of seeing that hopefully within the next 5 or 10 years, we'll be able to just search for Montana State University and good results will come in. So some of these are kind of a stopgap until our community continues to develop these great tools. So it was cool to be part of the panel with the ROAR. And then I want to just quickly talk about a community collaboration that we're in called the Data Discovery Collaboration. It's got members from all across the country, sort of spearheaded by NYU Langone Health. And the mission is to enhance discovery of data and other research products to maximize their value. And it has a governance structure with a steering committee and core groups on metadata and software development and advocacy. So by being part of the data discovery collaboration, all of us in this collaboration are sort of working through similar challenges. And so we're hoping as well that by talking with our colleagues here, we'll be able to improve our interface and help other people improve theirs. And so a quick thanks. We were funded by IMLS in 2018 and Network of National Libraries of Medicine in 2019. And we had a great advisory board in 2018 who helped with the startup phase of this. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Jason. That was a great presentation. So there's a few questions from the chat. And so the first one, Irena says, this is a really useful administrative and advocacy tool. The question is about a researcher use case. Are researchers interested in searching just for MSU data? Is that a use case you see?
I guess I wouldn't say researchers would be interested, but we think that people from MSU would be interested. As Jason was saying, those dashboards help us kind of see who's working with whom, who's publishing data and where they're publishing it. So it's helpful to the library, it's helpful to departments. And the other key factor in this is we're trying to make the data from MSU more discoverable and therefore want it to be used more and reused. So with that Google optimization or search engine optimization, we're hoping that by cataloging the data again in our dataset search, we're going to help it be found and therefore used.
Yeah, and you can see me shaking my head. This also harkens back to Layla worked on a project called MSU Research Citations, which has a similar kind of harvesting architecture, but the use case was really more for our internal folks and for us to do and start to understand. So Layla's project was more about open scholarship and citations that's produced. That's created some partnerships with the Office of Research Development and our Vice Provost for Research. So it's been more, the use case has been more about how do we help our community understand not only in our case, how data is produced and used within the community, but also what kinds of production are happening and what citations are happening. Layla's project actually produces a list of publications that goes out to the university. So very similar ways. The use case has more been about internal work, at least in building some of those networks up. And that's been one of the wins, I would say, locally for both of these projects.
Yeah, I have some insider knowledge. This stuff, it really is, yeah, helping to change the culture on campus. So that's my favorite use case.
Mhm.
And then there's two more questions. So we'll go with the easier one first, I think. Kristen asks, how are you handling data repositories that use accession numbers like NCBI?
That would be an opportunity for us to use their API because we're just searching APIs for names. So it doesn't really matter whether there's a DOI or an accession number. Going with just DataSite for now is a way to reduce the number of false positives we get, which is a lot with all of these names that are coming forward. So that's our main challenge right now, is just trying to get accurate records. So yeah, we would use their API to pull down the data from NCBI as well. But yeah, it's a huge landscape, and it's like there's a new challenge every week. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, can I add a little bit of information to that? On
Sure,
the DOI side
yeah.
of things? So with the NIH data sharing, new data sharing policy coming into effect in 2023, they just released a special funding announcement for biomedical repository updates and modernization, and we expect that will mean more DOI support and persistent identifier support in those repositories in general.
Mhm.
Nice.
I guess one technical note for the group. Those DOIs are really important to us because we actually create a hash of the DOI to help with deduping. So as long as something's got an API, we can kind of check against the saved hash in the database and say, okay, this is probably, we've seen this before. And so that helps with the harvesting. But again, the biggest challenge here is how do we really stand up that harvesting and help our human curators so they don't see a lot of these false positives.
Thanks.
Mhm.
And then Tomas asks, he says, thank you for sharing information about the CARE collaboration. What happens after the request for the data is made? Is the request managed somehow within the data search tool?
No, for now, the request is sent directly to James Burrows. So we have like a point person for those restricted data sets, and he's the project manager of CARE. And so they have their own system for deciding who can access the data. So we've kind of kept ourselves out of that process.
That's wonderful. That's thankfully a much easier answer than I expected.
Yeah, it's easier for us too. It seemed like for now will allow the people who have the data to sort of take those requests, but of course that isn't like a long-term solution when you think about researchers who move on. So I think by having it around that center, we have administrators of the center who can take care of it. Whereas when you get to individual researchers, you can have problems with getting in touch with them, down the line over the long term.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you all for a wonderful hour of presentations. This has been, just really fit well together, and thank you all for sharing your knowledge and for being with us. So the next presentation is in just a couple hours, and so to fit time zones. So make sure you double check your sched to see, to make sure that your time zones are correct so you don't show up at the wrong time, because it is just a couple hours from now that we get started again. So hope to see you all then. Bye.